I wanted to start with that video this morning because it just reminds me of kind of our main idea this morning, which is when I am weak, then I am strong. You know, I think about that video, if you caught the whole story there, you know, so much of what Rick, the son, so much of what he experiences, he only gets to experience through the strength of his father. Just because his dad is strong and the son is weak. And because of his weakness, his father can give him his strength. And that just reminds me so much of us. It is in our weakness that our Father can give us his strength. And when I am weak, then I am strong. You know, the times I think we can experience the power of God the most sometimes are in our places of personal weakness. We've been talking, you know, throughout this series, you know, we're almost there. We got one more week of this series, but we've been talking throughout this series, looking at how to be strong, how to be powerful, how to plug into God's power in our life. But today we're going to look at this, you know, this paradoxical statement made by Paul. When I am weak, then I am strong. I want to invite you to open your Bibles to 2 Corinthians chapter 11, please. 2 Corinthians chapter 11. Before we get to the heart of that, when I am weak, then I am strong, I want to give you some context what's going on in this passage. It's a little bit lengthy. We're not going to read everything we're kind of reviewing chapter 11 and chapter 12 and getting the heart of it in chapter 12. But I want to give you some of the context here. Paul's writing this letter to a church in Corinth, right? The city of Corinth. And this is an interesting situation to me because Paul started this church. Paul planted this church in Corinth. The people that were there at the very beginning is because he went there and ministered to it. He spent an extensive amount of time there in Corinth and got this church up and running and off the ground. Paul had a personal relationship with them. Paul now is writing them letters to instruct them and encourage them and help them and sometimes to correct them and challenge them. Paul would sometimes visit them. Paul would sometimes visit other people to go check on that church, go minister to them, go see how they're doing and come back and tell me what's going on. Paul had a very close relationship with this church, but now this church, or at least a good element of the church, a big element of the church I should say, have started to doubt Paul's leadership. They've started to question, do we really want to listen to this guy or not? And again, I just think, what a weird situation for Paul to be in. He's like, but I'm the one who founded this church. I'm the one who started this church. I'm the one who helped you guys and helped you understand who Christ was. But now they're starting to say, well, maybe we shouldn't follow Paul after all. And there were some other leadership now that had come into the church. Some other, and people argue about, well, were these apostles, or did they just claim to be apostles? At one place, Paul, I think, kind of sarcastically calls them super apostles. Paul's, you know, but these people who at least claim to have authority like Paul, they've come into the church and they're saying, you know, you don't want to listen to Paul. Paul doesn't really know what he's talking about. I mean, Paul has a lot of problems. Paul has a lot of weaknesses. Paul describes these new leaders in that church. He says, you know, these guys are really proclaiming another Jesus. He says they really have a different spirit than what I introduced to you. He even said that they preached a different gospel. He goes, this is not the same. What they're telling you is not what I told you. They are on a different page than I'm on. They start picking on Paul's weaknesses, claiming that he was inferior to them. You know, yeah, Paul's okay, but man, we're a lot better than Paul. Come on. Let's be honest. Paul isn't even a good speaker, right? Paul even addresses that. You know, maybe I'm not the best speaker. Sometimes in Paul's letters, you get this idea where he kind of says, look, I know there are some people who say, oh yeah, he's really bold in his letters. But when he shows up in person, he's not so bold, is he? Right? So they're kind of diminishing Paul and pulling him down a little bit. They even say, you know, he doesn't even do ministry right. I mean, he's not even a pro. When he comes into town, he doesn't give full time to the ministry. He's off making tents and selling them to support himself. And Paul goes, I can't believe that you're using that as a knock against me. But there's a lot of things they're doing to kind of bring Paul down. You don't want to listen to him. You don't want to follow him. Paul said these men were actually false apostles. He calls them deceitful workmen. He even calls them servants of Satan. That's what you do to win friends and influence people, right? Call them servants of Satan that come into the church. But ironically, again, I hope I'm explaining the situation right, because it's ironically, Paul found himself in a position of having to defend himself and even compare himself to these false apostles. And it wasn't because he wanted to lift himself up. It was out of love for the church. He'd say, man, I hate to see the church go down that road. And out of love for the church, he had had to prove himself to them. And again, what an ironic situation. They should be his credentials. But instead he's saying, I guess I have to prove myself to you. He had to demonstrate to this church, this group of believers, why they should follow him, why they should continue to follow him instead of following these new false apostles. And the situation had kind of become political. Don't you love political commercials? Let me tell you why I'm awesome and the other people are terrible, right? That's like the whole political season, and now it's always political season. Let me tell you why I'm great and they're terrible. And Paul said, I've gotten put in this spot now where I have to tell you what's wrong with them, and I got to tell you what's right with me. Paul said they had put him in the foolish position of having to boast, right? Because I don't want to boast. I don't want to brag. But and again, when you go home this week, read through 2 Corinthians 11. Just read through when he keeps pausing going, I can't believe I have to be this foolish. I can't believe I have to talk this way. But he says, you've put me in this foolish position where I have to boast of myself. We see it, for example, in chapter 11, verse 16. He says, I repeat, let no one think me foolish. But even if you do, accept me as a fool, so that I too may boast a little. What I'm saying with this boastful confidence, I say not as the Lord would, but as a fool. You catch what he said? I feel like he's frustrated with the situation. Saying the Lord would never talk this way, but you put me in a position, I have to talk this way now. I have to tell you what's right with me. I have to boast about myself. I feel foolish doing that. Verse 18, he says, since many boast according to the flesh, I too will boast. Right? I guess if that's what I have to do, I have to do. So Paul has to boast now, but if you were Paul, think about everything you know about Paul. If you were Paul and you said, well, I guess I'm going to have to boast, what would you boast about? I would boast about my education to start with. I think if I was Paul, Paul was trained by Gamaliel. Gamaliel was well-known, well-regarded, a famous rabbi. He was one of the leaders in the Sanhedrin, which was kind of the Jewish Supreme Court. He was a widely respected rabbi. And Paul could say, I was raised up by him. I was trained by him. I sat at his feet. I learned from him. I think I could have boasted about that. If I was Paul, I think I would have boasted about the churches I planted. We don't even know how many we planted. We know he planted at least 14 churches. If you planted 14 churches in your lifetime, well, that might feel like something to boast about. Well, let me tell you what I did. I planted 14 churches. If I was Paul, I might have boasted about the leaders I trained, right? Man, you guys know Titus and Timothy. Look how great I did with those guys. Great, upstanding men of God who love the Lord. I trained them. I prepared them for ministry. I might even boast about my salvation experience. Remember the story about Paul as he was Saul going down the Damascus road and Jesus shows up. A light from heaven, a voice from heaven. Jesus speaks to him personally. If I was Paul, I might have boasted about that. Yeah, you trusted Christ too, but let me tell you about my story. You ever hear people bragging about the worse you were before Jesus, the better your story is, right? Wrong. That's not true, right? But sometimes we act that way. Well, if you were really, really horrible, then we love to hear your salvation story. Paul could have bragged about that story. Well, I heard Jesus' voice. I saw his glory shining from heaven. If I was Paul, I might have boasted about some of the miracles I performed. Man, he did these apostolic miracles that he could have told, but he didn't boast about those things. Paul tells us what he boasts about in chapter 11, verse 30. Let's go ahead to that verse. He says, if I must boast, right? If I have to boast, if I'm in that spot, if I must boast, I will boast of the things that show my weakness. I don't think Paul knows how to do this, right? You don't boast about your weaknesses. But that's the first thing we see here. Paul boasted about his weaknesses. And as we jump back into this passage, we're going to go up a little bit in this passage to verse 22. We're going to see the things that he boasts about. First, we see him boast about his trials in ministry. And remember, he's comparing himself with these other so-called apostles, these false apostles. So let's pick it up in verse 22. He says, are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they the offspring of Abraham? So am I. Right? So far, so good. So far, we're even. But now he takes another step. Verse 23. Are they servants of Christ? I am a better one. Woo! Now he's throwing down, right? They think they're servants of Christ. I'm even better than them. He says, but notice what he said. I'm talking like a madman. He goes, again, I feel stupid saying this. But you want to compare us? Okay, let's compare it. With far greater labors, far more imprisonments, with countless beatings, and often near death. 5 times I received at the hands of the Jews the 40 lashes less one, right? So when he got whipped, they whipped you 39 times. He says that happened to me over and over again, 5 times. 3 times, verse 25, 3 times I was beaten with rods. So that's when he's getting beat by the Roman authorities. Once I was stoned, right? They literally picked up stones and threw them at me until they thought I was dead. Maybe he was dead. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I was adrift at sea on frequent journeys, in danger from rivers, danger from robbers, danger from my own people, danger from Gentiles, danger in the city, danger in the wilderness, danger at sea, danger from false brothers, in toil and hardship, through many a sleepless night, in hunger and thirst, often without food, in cold and exposure, and apart from other things, right? He says that's all the circumstances I had to endure. But even apart from that, he's got an inner struggle he talks about now. He says apart from other things, there's the daily pressure on me of my anxiety for all the churches, right? He goes, man, I worry about how are the churches doing that weighs on me. Verse 29, he says, who is weak and I am not weak? Who is made to fall and I am not indignant? If I must boast, then I will boast in things that show my weakness. All the things he just mentioned, nothing there makes you look strong. Being in prison doesn't make you look strong, right? Not very strong when you're dragged off to prison. Being hungry and thirsty doesn't make you look strong. Living a life of constant danger doesn't make you look strong. Sleepless, anxious, doesn't make you look strong. Then he gives us another example of his weakness. If you go to verse 31, he tells this little story. Verse 31, he says, the God and Father of the Lord Jesus, he who is blessed forever, he knows that I am not lying. At Damascus, the governor under King Aretas was guarding the city of Damascus in order to seize me. But I was let down in a basket through a window in the wall and escaped his hands. Now again, if you were in Sunday school and you grew up and you saw that little thing on the flannel graph story, you saw the little thing of Paul getting in the basket and going down, it may not have occurred to you, but this was not a dignified way to exit the city, right? The great Apostle Paul. Remember what he's telling us? What he's telling us here is, these are my times of weakness. What an undignified way. He had to sneak out in the middle of the night, crawling into a basket, getting lowered down by night so that he wouldn't get in trouble, stopped at the gate. He's saying, look at all the times in my ministry when I've had these trials. Next, Paul boasts about something else, something different, this thorn in the flesh. So first he's talking about, man, I've been weak a lot, but now let me tell you about a personal weakness I have. He calls it here the thorn in the flesh. In chapter 12, starting in verse 1, he says, I must go on boasting. Right? I guess I'll tell you more about my weaknesses. He says, though there is nothing to be gained by it, I will go on to visions and revelations of the Lord. I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up to the third heaven. Whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. And I know that this man was caught up into paradise. Whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. And he heard things that cannot be told, which man may not utter. On behalf of this man I will boast, but on my own behalf I will not boast, except of my weaknesses. Now let's stop and think about this for a moment, because the way it's written there, he's making a point here, but it can look a little confusing in the first read. Who's the man he's talking about? Hey, I know a guy. Who's the guy he's talking about? He's talking about himself. Why is he talking about it in third person? Because he's saying, if I tell you this incredible story, see, then it looks like I'm boasting about this wonderful thing I experienced. Have you ever told a story about somebody in third person? Especially if you don't want to claim it, right? You want some advice or you want some help, you don't want to say it was you, and you say, hey doctor, let me ask you a question. I know a guy who did something really stupid, right? I know a guy who hammered his hand to the wall. Wasn't me. That's a terrible example. I don't know why that's what I came with. But the point is this. Paul's talking about himself, but he's talking about it in a way to say it's not himself, right? It's not that he's denying it. It's kind of a tongue-in-cheek way of saying, let me tell you about this guy. Let me tell you about this guy that had an incredible experience. Let me tell you about this guy, what happened to him. It happened to him 14 years ago. He was caught up into the third heaven. What's the third heaven? The third heaven is what we just, heaven itself. But in the Bible, and even the way we use the word heaven, heaven can describe where the birds fly around, right? That's the heaven, that's the sky. The second heaven is space, right? The heavens, as in the heavens declare the glory of God, right? The heavens, outer space. But he says the third heaven is talking about the abode of God, the place of God's dwelling. He says, this person I'm telling you about, it was me, was caught up into heaven. He also describes it here as paradise. He was caught up and he saw incredible things. He saw things, he heard things that he can't even tell you about. He goes, no, I'm not going to boast about myself, but I'll boast about that guy. Let me tell you about that guy. But then he turns it around. And again, why is he even telling us about that experience? Because he's not doing it to brag about that experience. That's why he's distancing himself from it. He's telling about that experience to explain about the thorn of the flesh. I hope this makes sense. So let's go ahead and pick it up and see what he says next. In verse 6. He says, though I should wish to boast, I would not be a fool, for I would be speaking the truth. But I refrain from it, so that no one may think more of me than he sees in me or hears from me. So, to keep me from becoming conceited. That's how we know he was talking about himself in the third person, right? Because he goes, that happened to me. And I would have been very conceited by that event. I would have thought, wow, I must be something special. If God did that for me, he doesn't do it for everybody. So to keep me from becoming conceited, he says in verse 7, because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, here it is, a thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from becoming conceited. And 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weaknesses, and insults and hardships, persecutions and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong. So let's go back to this. Paul boasts about his thorn in the flesh. What's the thorn in the flesh? Well, I read a lot of commentaries this week. Let me tell you what they thought. Thorn in the flesh is either ophthalmia. I should have put that one first. Ophthalmia, or it might have been migraine headaches, or it might have been epilepsy, or a speech impediment, or gallstones, or gout, or malaria, or rheumatism, or his wife. Ladies, I didn't say that. Some commentators said, maybe it's his wife. It's the thorn. Maybe it's these false teachers he's talking about. Maybe it's some sort of incessant temptation he struggled with. Or maybe it was something else. You know what that means? That means we have no idea what it was. Right? Some people really think from other things that Paul wrote that he struggled with his eyesight, that maybe it was something about that. But we don't really know what it was. We don't know what it was, and honestly, it doesn't matter what it was. What does matter is it was a very personal thing, like we've all had, right? We've all had personal trials come into our life that we felt like, why is this happening to me? This doesn't happen to everybody else. Why does this happen to me? Why is this a struggle I have that other people don't have? This is how I felt when I had kidney stones, right? Why kidney stones, right? A lot of people have a lot of other things. Why did I get this one? There was something personal that happened to Paul that came into his life and did not go away. It was his thorn in the flesh. But this is an important thing for us to understand. It was sent by Satan to harass him. But it was sent by God to humble him. Right? He said, Satan sent it to harass me. But God sent it so that I wouldn't become conceited. That I wouldn't be so lifted up by my experiences. And I had this incredible vision. Again, notice how he says twice, I don't know if this happened in the body or out of the body. Right? I had this incredible experience of being brought up into heaven. Because I still don't know what happened. I don't know if God took my whole body up into heaven and brought it back. I don't know if God just somehow took my spirit so I could see what was going on in heaven. Because I don't even understand exactly what happened. But it was the most incredible thing. I saw visions. I saw revelations. But God said, look, I got to do something to keep this guy humble. And so he allowed Satan to bring this into his life. We need to remember that when we have personal struggles, they're designed by Satan to hurt you. But they are allowed by God to help you. And isn't it true that sometimes in the middle of suffering or pain, we forget that? Well, if God really loved me and he has the power to stop this, why doesn't he? I don't know. But I do know that what God allows to come into our life is trials and temptations. He allows Satan to do it. Satan loves to do it because he wants to hurt you. He wants to harass you. But God wants to help you. And the truth is, the way we respond to it is going to decide whether it helps us or not. Whether it hurts us or helps us will be determined by how we react to it. If Satan tries to do it to harm us and we react in the wrong way, he'll get exactly what he wanted. And it will damage us spiritually and emotionally and maybe other ways. But if we respond to it correctly, then God will be able to use it to help us in the way he intends to help us. So up till now, we've been seeing Paul boasting in his weaknesses, right? Now he tells us why he will only boast in his weakness, as we read. Paul experienced God's power in his weakness. Paul experienced God's power in his weakness. Notice Paul says he repeatedly pleaded with God to take whatever this thorn in the flesh was. He repeatedly said, oh God, please, please, please. Have you had those things in your life? If you've been a Christian very long, I know you have. You've had those things in your life. You don't know why this struggle is there. You don't know why this trial is there. You don't know why, whatever that is for you. And you have gotten on your knees. Maybe you even fasted. You spent half a day, or maybe it was just every day it was on your mind. And you pleaded with God, please, God, just take this away. Take it away because it hurts, or take it away because I feel like it's holding me back, or take it away because, oh God, don't you understand? I could be so much better for you if I didn't have this thing that I struggled with in my life. And Paul says, I pleaded with him, and I pleaded with him, and I pleaded with him. And it wasn't that God didn't answer. It's that God did answer. And his very clear answer was, Paul, no, I'm not going to take that away from you. Sometimes we beg God to change our circumstances when God is trying to use our circumstances to change us. And I know I said something about that a couple weeks ago, but I think it's true here again. We see it. Sometimes we go, God, please just change this circumstance, change this thing. And God says, I'm not going to change that thing because I'm trying to use that thing to change you. There's something I'm trying to do in you. And I'm trying to use that thing that you hate, that thing you wish you didn't have to deal with, that thing that's right now causing you pain. It is a thorn in your flesh. And I'm trying to use that thing to help you. I'm not going to take it away. And the specific things that he told us here that I think were great information for Paul to have, but also great information for us to have. First of all is, notice he says, my grace is sufficient for you. I think we have to be careful when people are going through hard times, not to just use pithy lines from the Bible to say, oh, well, God says my grace is sufficient for you, you can be fine. But this is true. His grace is sufficient for us. Whatever it is that we go through, whatever it is we struggle through, whatever that thorn is, when God says, I'm not going to take it away, he also says, my grace is sufficient for you. My kindness toward you, my provision for you, what I have to offer you. And again, that word sufficient, I don't know how often we use that word, but think about what that means. It is sufficient. It is enough. Whatever it is that you're struggling with, my grace is enough to cover that. It is enough. It's not almost enough. It's not half of enough. It is enough. It is sufficient. It is everything. I think sometimes our greatest hindrances in our reliance on God and experiencing God's power in our life is our own self-sufficiency. Our self-sufficiency. God doesn't want us to depend on ourselves. He wants us to depend on his grace. But we say, wait a minute, we're Americans. We're very self-sufficient people. We're very pull yourself up by the bootstraps. Come on, let's go. I've got this. I've got the power. I mean, that's the thing you hear people say, we're going to do it. You got this. You got this. What do we mean? We mean I have the power. If I just try enough, I can do it. I am self-sufficient. I can accomplish whatever I set my mind to. That's what my parents told me. I am enough. I am strong enough. I'm powerful enough. I'm good enough. And sometimes I'm not. And sometimes my self-sufficiency keeps me from relying on the sufficiency of God's grace and saying, I'm not sufficient in myself. I need his grace to help me because I cannot do what I ought to do. I cannot live the life he wants me to live without his help. And it's in those moments that God's power sometimes shows up. And we realize I am not sufficient, but his grace is sufficient. The second point he makes here is my power is made perfect in weakness. Soak on that for just a minute. My power is made perfect. Well, wasn't God's power already perfect? You know, the way we usually use the word perfect in English, we usually use the word perfect means 100%, right? Perfect means without error, right? That's how we use perfect. But in the Bible, usually the word perfect, it's from a Greek word that means to come to full maturity or to realize your full potential. That's the idea. It's talking about something that it starts here, but when it really accomplishes its purpose, that's when it's described as perfect. So God's power becomes perfect in us when we allow his power to come. God's power is always awesome. God's power is always wonderful. But God says, my power finds its purpose, fulfills its purpose in you when you allow my power to come in you. When you allow my power to come in and be the thing that helps you. That's when it reaches its fulfillment. That's when it reaches its maturity. God's power accomplishes its purpose in our lives when we are weak. We don't like to think that way. We don't want to be weak, right? It reminds me of, I heard about generators. I don't know anything about generators. I know they produce power. But I know there's different kinds of generators. There's some kind of generator that you start the generator and it puts out a certain amount of power, right? That's what it does. It just puts out that much power. But there's another kind of generator that only puts out as much power as you need, right? So you start at that generator. If in your whole household, if all you're doing is trying to run one little light bulb, that generator is going to put out enough power to power that light bulb, and that's all it's going to put out. But if you need that generator to run every appliance in your house and all the lights and all, then it's going to put out a ton of power because it's needed. And that reminds me of what God is saying here. He's saying, you know what, it is when you are weak, when you recognize your need for my power, that's when my power can really come in and do. Let's not just let God. Sometimes we want God's power to save us from hell. We go, that's the power I want. But I don't want his power in all these other areas. I don't want his power in my marriage. I don't want his power with me raising kids. I can do that. I don't want his power with me going to work. I know how to do that. But God says, why don't you say, God, I want your power in every area of my life. I am not self-sufficient. Your grace is sufficient, and your power is made perfect in me when I say, I'd rather choose to be weak, so that God's power can flood into me and help me to do what he wants me to do. In our flesh, we'd rather just be stronger, right? In our flesh, we go, man, I'd rather I just didn't need God at all. I'd rather I'm just stronger by myself. I wish I just had the power. But that's not how it works. Paul says, I'd rather be weaker if it means knowing God's power better. So here's the third point. So Paul chose to be content with his weakness. I think that's hard. That's a tough one right there. To be content. Look at what he says again in verse 10. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content. Look at the list. I'm content with weaknesses, with insults, with hardships, with even persecutions and calamities. Oh, I'm content with that, Lord. I'm content. Bring it on. I'm content. That's an interesting place of spiritual maturity. For Paul to say, the reason I could do all the things I've done in my ministry, the reasons I could endure all the trials I've explained to you that I've been through, the reason I could do it is because God's power showed up in all those times of weakness, and I'm content to have all those weaknesses. Because in those times of weaknesses, God showed up and was strong. And that's what's really important anyway. So two things under that. How could Paul choose to be content with those things? First of all, he says at the beginning of that verse, for the sake of Christ. He doesn't say, I can be content with those terrible things because I just enjoy it. I'm a masochist. I just enjoy having terrible things happen to me. Isn't that wonderful? He doesn't say that. He says, for the sake of Christ, I can be content with those things. For the sake of Christ, I can be content with my weaknesses. If it's for his sake. Because my goal in life should not be me being happy. My goal in life should not be me being better. My goal in life should not be that my life is easier. My goal in life should be I want to glorify him. And if it is for his sake, if it's for the sake of Christ, okay, then I'm willing to be weak. If it's for the sake of Christ, then I'm willing to go through tribulations. If it's for the sake of Christ, I can be content with those things. But that means us in our mind and in our spirit, we have to be willing to say, it is not my happiness that's most important, it's him that's most important. For the sake of Christ, I can be content with those things. If I'm truly living for the sake of Christ, I can be content with those things. Think about when God gets the most glory. Just a couple of examples I want to remind you from the Old Testament. One of the things that the Bible repeats probably more than anything else was when God showed up and rescued his people out of Egypt. God points back to that over and over and over again. Why? Because that was one of the times of greatest weakness. They were in a terrible situation. They'd been slaves for 400 years. They were powerless. They had no hope. But they called on God, and God showed up. God rescued them out of Egypt. So God was glorified. But he would not have been glorified in that situation had they not been in a time of weakness. Think about the story of David and Goliath. If we're not careful, we get the story of David and Goliath, it's about a little guy taking on a big guy. That is not the story of David and Goliath. Because in the story of David and Goliath, God is the big guy. The big guy beat the little guy, Goliath. That's what really happened in that story. But the reason God gets so much glory out of the story of David and Goliath is because David shows up in weakness. David was the youngest kid in his family. David wasn't even old enough to be in the army. He wasn't even supposed to be there. He's so small that he can't even put on the armor. And he goes out with nothing but a slingshot. But in his weakness, God infuses power, and David has this incredible victory. God gets glory in our times of weakness because it's in his weakness, in our weakness, that his strength shows up. For the sake of Christ, we should be willing to be content with our weaknesses. My family went this week to see an air show, Hartsville Air Show. And it was so cool, man, watching these planes fly around, do tricks, all this stuff. And I'm like, wow, I couldn't do one of them. I get nervous getting on a plane and just hitting a little turbulence, you know. But these guys are like flying around doing somersaults and twists and turns and all this kind of stuff. But that night was interesting because a little ways away, there were dark clouds. A little ways away, you can go see, there's it raining pretty heavy over there. Everybody out there's on their phones, like, which way is it coming? Which way is it coming? Meanwhile, these guys are flying around. Then there's lightning. Oh, don't you love flying when there's lightning? That's exciting, right? But they announced, and they said, we've decided as long as it's, 5 miles away, these guys are going to keep going. And they're doing their tricks as fast as they can because they want to get done before the weather gets there. But there was a time, I remember, when a couple of the planes were up there doing whatever tricks they were, and all of a sudden what you saw was, you're looking up at these two planes, and you see lightning right behind them. And we're all like, I don't think that's 5 minutes or 5 miles away anymore. It's like right there. These guys are still going about their business, And this is when my kids lean over to me and start asking questions like kids do. And, when you're brilliant, you have no answers, right? Hey, Dad, what happens when lightning strikes a plane? Hey, Dad, what would happen if, I'm like, I said, I don't know. And I'm just making stuff up. I'm like, it would probably, I guess it could fry the electrical there. I don't know what, maybe he's wearing a parachute. I don't know, but let's get him down here. I appreciate it, but maybe this thing should end now. But then I was talking later on to Dad, actually, and he said, there are some planes that actually have a parachute on the plane itself. I thought, that's kind of cool. So that way, if the pilot becomes incapacitated, right? If something happens and he passes out from doing 12G tricks, whatever, and all of a sudden he's done and the plane starts to fall, on the parachute, on the plane itself is a parachute that senses you're in trouble, and all of a sudden that parachute pops out and allows the plane to slowly crash land. Now, that story just reminded me of this because if you're the parachute manufacturer, now I'm sure you hope nothing will ever go wrong. But if you want people to be really, really impressed with your parachute, there's got to be a little bit of you going, boy, it'd be great to see that pilot pass out, right? Because then everybody will see how great the parachute is. Everybody will go, wow, look at the parachute. But not everybody's going to know what's happening. Oh no, he's coming down. Oh, what's going to happen? All of a sudden that parachute comes out. And now everybody's going, man, that's a pretty amazing parachute. That's pretty cool technology. Look how they put that. Now I hope this illustration makes sense. Because this is my point. If that plane is never in trouble, the parachute is never needed. Nobody ever gets to enjoy it, For us, if we were never in trouble, we'd never need God. God would never have to show up. And the problem with that is, then God would never get the glory for being the God who shows up in our times of weakness and rescues us. And as long as we want to be our own strength, as long as we want to buck up and just take it ourselves and we're going to do it, I can do this, then God never gets the glory for being what rescues us in our time of weakness. For the sake of Christ, we should be content with our trials and our weaknesses, and even as he says, persecutions and calamities. Because we know those are the times that God really shines. Those are the times that God really is seen for who he is. In our times of weakness. And the second thing he says, so the first one was, that for the sake of Christ, I'll be content. But then he also says this, for when I am weak, then I am strong. When I am weak, and then I allow God's power to really come into my life and help me in that time of weakness, That's really when I'm strong. When I am weak. One last thought I want to share with you about this is that Paul imitated the weakness of Jesus. As we go through here, we see him talking about, man, I'm weak. When I'm weak, I'm strong. Let me tell you about my weaknesses. I want to boast about my weaknesses. But Paul was actually imitating the weakness of Jesus. Because Jesus did a lot of powerful things, right? We can sit here and take, if I ask you the question, well, what's something Jesus did to show his power? Man, we go on and on. About all the people he healed and the storms he stopped, the miracles he did. But the most powerful thing Jesus did, he did choosing to be weak, right? Through weakness. If you go over one more chapter, you go to 2 Corinthians 13, in verse 4. Talking about Christ, it says, for he was crucified in weakness. But he lives by the power of God. For we also are weak in him. But in dealing with you, he says, we will live with him by the power of God. So he's saying, you know what? We have a pretty good example of it. This idea of being weak to accomplish the power of God, he goes, you know, that's what Jesus did on the cross. He chose to be weak. When we choose to allow our weaknesses to be used by God for his glory, for his purposes, we're following some pretty good examples. We're following the example of Paul. We're also following the example of Christ. So this morning we're going to celebrate when Jesus chose to be weak for us. When he chose to be crucified for us. When Jesus could have been strong. I've often thought about the scenario with the cross, and I know, there's so much there between what's happening humanly, what's happening divinely. The plan of God, Jesus would do nothing else but go to that cross. But man, isn't it tempting sometimes to think about that scenario and think, man, can you imagine when people are heckling you and overpowering you and nailing you to that cross and even then making fun of you and mocking you? And in that moment, in a moment, Jesus could have been very strong. And he could have said, remember when he talked about, man, I could have called a whole bunch of angels to come rescue me right now. But he chose to be weak anyway. Because in choosing to be weak, he rescued us. In choosing to be weak, he did the most powerful thing. So we're going to celebrate that this morning. I just want to invite you with that concept in mind. Today, when you eat the bread, I encourage you, think about the weakness of Jesus to allow himself to have his body broken for us. And when you drink the juice, I just want you to think about Jesus choosing to be weak enough to allow them to beat him up and spill his blood for us. He became weak so we could have the power of God. I want to invite you to think about the first time you accepted Christ. Because the first time, I shouldn't say the first time, the time you accepted Christ. If you think about it in this context, that was the first time you came and said, I am weak and I cannot do it on my own. Right? That's what it is. When we come and trust in Christ, that's what we're saying. I'm too weak. I'm too weak to get to heaven on my own. I'm too weak to live the life God wants me to live. I'm too weak to handle the sin in my own life. I'm too weak. I need God to rescue me and save me from that. In Romans 5:6-8, it says this, for while we were still weak, at the right time Christ died for the ungodly. For one will scarcely die for a righteous person. Perhaps for a good person one would even dare to die. But God shows his love for us, and that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. In our greatest weakness, that's when we came to him, in our greatest weakness. Lord, I'm too weak. I need you to help me. If you haven't yet trusted in Jesus today, may I please, just act. I don't know what's holding you back. But if there's something holding you back from trusting Christ, you need to get past that. You need to get beyond that. It is too important to keep waiting and delaying. You need to recognize your own weakness and say, you know what, I am too weak to take care of sin in my own life. Don't put it off anymore. You need to trust in Christ as your Savior and admit your weakness to him and allow him and his power, the power to forgive you, the power to make him part of your family, the power to come into your life and change who you are. But you have to come to him humbly in weakness and trust what he did for you on the cross. If you haven't trusted in Christ, I encourage you to do that today. If you have trusted in Christ, I encourage you to use this time of communion. Don't let it just be another time we do communion. Make every time you observe communion, make every time meaningful. And today I encourage you to come and remember the weakness of Christ for you so that you can have his power in your life.